Hey everybody. In my last video, I made a video about dynamic configurations at a high level, but I wanted to get more specific on how we can actually use them in our code. So I'm going to use AWS AppConfig. AWS AppConfig makes a lot of sense because it advertises dynamic configurations in the product overview. I'm first going to make a configuration from scratch, and then I'm going to show the code that references it. All the code will be available through my GitHub in the description of this video. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to do is create an application name. I'm just going to call this demo application and hit create. Then in the configuration profiles and feature flags section, I'm going to create a freeform configuration. There's also this feature flag configuration, but feature flags are strictly true false values, where freeform configuration can be anything, including true false values. For the name, I'm going to enter demo flag. And the source, I'll just leave it as the default AWS app config. And the content, I'll do JSON, and I'll paste in something I have. So I have a JSON that has a key of my feature and then another key inside that called amount with a value of 3. We'll hit next, and we're going to skip any validations on the schema and create our configuration profile. Now, just because we created it doesn't mean it's live and active. In order to make it live and active, we have to deploy it. So let's start a deployment. I don't have an environment existing yet. An environment you can think of as something like beta or prod, or maybe even your own testing environment. So let's create an environment. I'm going to call this demo environment. And the environments are really cool because you can attach different monitors to them. So if there's any alarm that goes off, you can roll back automatically. But I'm not going to do that in this video. I'll just create the environment. And then in our configuration we made, we only have one version, so we'll deploy the first. And then on the deployment strategy, there's some nice default ones built in, but I'm going to make a different one to deploy even faster. I'll call it instant no bake. We're going to deploy to 100% of the environment. There will be 0 minutes of time in between and no bake time. Now we're ready to do our deployment. So I'll scroll down and hit start deployment. And you can see it started and completed instantly because of that no bake deployment I did. Now we're ready to use this from our code. So this is a very scrappy prototype I made. Starting at the top, we have the AppConfig client that uses the AWS SDK. We have the names of our application, environment, and profile. I wrote a wrapper class to wrap our value and something called the session token, which we'll talk about momentarily. The first thing we need to do to talk to AppConfig is call the start configuration session API. And by doing so, we pass in our 3 flags and the time that we want to look at to refresh. We can only refresh every 15 seconds. That's the fastest we can go. When we call this API, we'll get a token back, which allows us to retrieve the next value. So that's what the session token is going to be. The other API we call to retrieve the configuration is called getLatestConfiguration, and we need to pass in a token every time we call the API. When we call the API, it returns the configuration if there's a new one available, and it returns the next token to use. I have an execute method that creates the feature flag wrapper, does the initialize session, and then enters a loop. And the loop is going to continually retrieve the configuration, update the token, update the value, and then do some business logic. At the very end, it sleeps for 16 seconds. That 16 is coming from 1 more second than we have to wait for. The business logic function I have is very, very simple. It just looks at the value, and if it's less than 5, it prints out the value is small. If it's less than 10, it prints out medium. Otherwise, it prints out large. So let's see what this looks like in action. So I'm executing my script, and it's printing the current timestamp and the value it's getting from AppConfig. And because we created the initial configuration with the value of 3, that is what we're seeing. So every 16 seconds, this is going to update. So now that we're seeing it's updating, I'm going to go back to the AWS console and we'll deploy a new value. So we'll go back to the demo application, click our demo flag, and we'll create a new version. And let's go to 7 now as the amount. So I'll create that version, and that's going to be version 2, and I have to deploy version 2 now. So I'll start the deployment to my demo environment using 2 and my instant no-bake deployment strategy. I'll start the deployment, and let's check on the script. So the script is now updating to be the value of 7, and we're seeing that in the code. So the script has not stopped executing. Let's try it one more time with the value of maybe something like 15. We'll go back to the demo application one more time, click our demo flag, create a new version, and we'll choose 15 for our value. One really cool thing you can do is compare the versions. So if I wanted to compare versions 3 to 2, it shows me what's changing. I'll go ahead and deploy that latest version. Version 3, start deployment, should be active now. Let's switch back. And there's the new value. So if I want to go back to a previous version, I don't need to create another one. I can just do a deployment and select, let's go back to version 1 and deploy that. As soon as we do, we'll check the script. So now it goes back to the value of small. So this is a very scrappy prototype of what it looks like to use AWS AppConfig in practice. If you're interested in looking at this code, it will be linked in the description below. Thank you for watching.